In this episode of Philosophy Matti Interviews, my guest is David Benatar, the author of books such as Better Never to Have Been, The Human Predicament, and Very Practical Ethics, known as the founder of contemporary anti-natalism. On the Exploring Anti-natalism podcast channel, he needs no further introduction. Happy to have you here, David. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Nice to be with you.
Your 2006 book, Better Never to Have Been, is important to the international community of antinatalists. It is for many the first and for some the only academic source to the philosophy and theory of this way of thinking. Different people have, however, interpreted the book differently. One notable difference that I've seen has been in how the role of killing, taking lives deliberately and intentionally, is seen. Some think that no killing is allowed, others that the whole range of exceptions is possible. To seek clarity to this issue, I formulated an imaginary case. You have seen my short videos on the Exploring Antinatalism podcast channel, my Marzipan Chronicles. The story there is that I'm the last human being alive, I'm dying soon, and my guinea pig companion Marzipan, also the last of her species, although in good health now, would predictably live and die in misery without me. So my question to you is, would you and would Better Never to Have Been permit me to kill Marzipan, and on what considerations would the verdict be based on?
Thank you. Well, I think that the question you've posed in that video and now summarized is somewhat tangential to what I'm dealing with in Better Never to Have Been. I can explain why, but perhaps I should first of all say that I can't remember exactly what I've said in that book as distinct from other places. And I know that some of what has preoccupied you is the question about what I, in my incarnation in that book, would say about this particular problem. So given this difficulty that I have in separating up what I've said there and what I've said elsewhere, I may just speak more generally. But from what I can recall, the question that you've raised is, I think, tangential to the content of the book. The book is really about procreation. It has implications for extinction. And in speaking about extinction, I've spoken about two different ways in which that can be brought about. The one is through not creating new lives, and the other is by killing existing lives. And so when I deal with extinction through killing, I'm really dealing with killing in the context of extinction. And in general, I'm opposed to bringing extinction about by way of killing beings. The case that you present is a case in which the guinea pig species will become extinct as a result of my killing Marzipan if I do decide to kill Marzipan. But I don't think that the decision to be made there is primarily one about extinction. It's primarily about the well-being of Marzipan. As I understand the way you've described this case, Marzipan is fine at the moment and will continue to be fine after I die. But at some further point in the future, she's going to suffer very badly if I don't euthanize her before I die. And so what I take this to be is really a case of euthanasia, but not in the paradigmatic sense where we are now or imminently dealing with a being whose life is so bad that death would be the lesser of two evils. Instead, we're dealing about a much more enhanced prophylactic kind of euthanasia, where you're killing now to prevent a great deal of suffering in the further future. And that, I think, does present special difficulties. So let me leave it there for now and see if you have anything to say about the way I've set up this problem.
Yes, we can for all I care, we can forget about extinction here, because I did find out in my chronicles in the second part that although you make the distinction between killing extinction and dying of extinction and apply it only to humans and not explicitly to non-humans and blah blah blah, I on the next page I found that you are not that concerned about the species dying, even in the case of animal non-human animal death, but you are more interested in their death and the badness of that. As for your euthanasia plan, and I'm sort of reading that you might go along with that. I'm happy to see that you agree with yourself or your artificial intelligence representation, David Benatar's philosophy guide. I asked them the same question and received essentially the same answer that you are giving between the lines. Noting that you don't explicitly discuss a case like this in Better Never to Have Been, the bot concluded that your broader ethical framework is likely to morally permit, if not endorse, that was added by the bot, the preemptive euthanasia of marzipan as a means of preventing future suffering. Good for the designers of the bot, I'm sure. Perhaps the closest that you come to this case in the book is abortion. You argue that human embryos and fetuses already in some kind of existence should be aborted before they acquire an interest in their own lives. And you go on to argue that some late-term abortions of the development of consciousness and even some instances of infanticide may be morally desirable if they prevent the continuation of particularly unpleasant existences. I'm trying to establish the proper boundaries of the legitimacy of killing here, really. So my question to you is, are the moral justifications that you would use the same or the different in the cases of abortion and infanticide on the one hand and euthanizing marzipan on the other hand, if you go ahead and allow marzipan to be euthanized?
I think if we're speaking about abortion prior to the emergence of sentience, then we're speaking about preventing a being from coming into existence. And that would be unlike the case of marzipan, because marzipan as a sentient being already exists as a sentient being. And so that's not a case, killing her was not a case of preventing her existence. It's preventing a continued existence. In other words, killing her. So it's not like abortion through most of pregnancy. Once we're speaking about a sentient fetus or a fortiori a neonate, now we're speaking about terminating a life. And so then I think the question is whether continued existence is worse than death or the other way around. Now, in most cases where we are thinking about euthanasia of neonates, for example, we're thinking about beings who are now suffering very badly. And so the decision is in some sense easier in those cases. It's still not easy because these are very difficult questions to answer. I mean, in part because there's more than one component question. One component question is, how bad is the suffering from the subjective point of view? And that's often hard to determine. It's often hard to get into the mind of another being, even if it's a human baby, but even more so if it's of another species. It's hard to get into the mind. And another question to ask is, well, how bad is death? And that's a whole nother question that people can disagree about. Some people think that death is not bad at all for merely sentient beings. I actually think that death is pretty bad for merely sentient beings. But that's another component question. And then you've got to put these together in order to work out whether death is in the overall interests or against the overall interests of the being. The Marzipan case is so complicated, further complicated, because she's fine now and she will be for the foreseeable future. And that's a problem in itself, but it also introduces a further problem, and that is how in the real world I would know that her end is going to be so bad.
Yes, your bot used the term preemptive euthanasia, which was kind of surprising to me. But I do get your point that early abortion is the odd one out here, because that's when sentience hasn't set in. Then late abortion and infanticide and marzipan are similar in that sentience case anyway. Well, at this point, it might be useful to make a distinction. Now, early human abortion, late human abortion, human infanticide, and non-human euthanasia may in some instances be morally justified, but they do not necessarily fall under your definition of antinatalism, of course. In our definition panel last year, and I think that Better Never to Have Been did sort of imply this, you said antinatalism, noun, is the view that it is morally wrong to bring sentient beings into existence. And this gives rise to some follow-up questions on and around the Marzipan case. To begin with, is any of the cases discussed so far antinatalism? I mean, early abortion may be the best candidate as it prevents the emergence of sentience and hence all and any pain that could be experienced in the future by the being whose life is terminated. But then the being, without pain but nonetheless, has already been brought into some kind of existence. And I wonder if you could help me out here conceptually. So my question is, how can this case, early human abortion, best be understood as an instance of antinatalism or something else?
Well, the way you just summarized the question seems different from the question that I thought you were asking in the lead up to the summary. So let me deal with the way you formulated towards the end first, and then I'll come to the other. The antinatalism doesn't, I think, imply a particular view about early abortions. As I say in the book, or at least as I recall saying in the book, you have to combine antinatalism with some view about when somebody comes into existence in a morally relevant way. If you combine antinatalism with the view that conception is the time when somebody comes into existence in a morally relevant way, then no abortions amount to preventing somebody from existing. All abortions would then amount to killing somebody. If, on the other hand, you take the view that I happen to take, which is that we come into existence in a morally relevant way when we become sentient, then if you combine that with antinatalism, then we ought to abort in the early stages because we're actually preventing a being from coming into existence rather than from terminating a being. But this is not the question I thought you were asking in the lead up to the summary of the question. I thought you were asking, well, really, what's the relevance of antinatalism to the case of Marzipan? And that brings me back to the opening remarks that I made, which is I don't think there's a connection here. I think the question you're posing to me about Marzipan, that case, that dilemma, is really not distinctively antinatalist at all. I don't think that what divides people here is going to be whether they're antinatalists or not. I think what's going to divide people here are the other questions that I enumerated, namely, how bad is death for Marzipan? And then there's the point about the preemptiveness. And funny that the bot, I want to hear more about this bot in due course, but I have used that term before, maybe not in print, but I have used the term of preemptive euthanasia. So I do see this as a case of preemptive euthanasia. And there'd be questions around the challenges of that. But I don't think that's got anything to do with antinatalism.
Yes, the case of Marzipan is not a case of antinatalism as such, and I agree with you in there. Now, as a word of explanation, I am, as you well know, I'm an applied ethicist and a bioethicist. So when we talk about unconscious violinists in hospital beds being kidnapped during the night to save some other people's life, we are of course talking about abortion. And when we are talking about nieces drowned in a bathtub, we are of course talking about euthanasia. So we are always talking about something else. My apologies for that one. I think that in this question I understand your train of thought, but it sounds a little complicated, and maybe my confusion here stems from the fact that better never to have been for me has always been a combination of three interrelated but separate things. Deep pessimism, your view that life and death are both bad. Human and sentient extinctionism, the view that it would be better if humanity became extinct. That's what somebody says in the back cover. And my argument applies not only to humans, but also to all other sentient beings. That's what you said on page 2. And then the third thing is emerging antinatalism, the view that people should not have children, obviously, but what, if anything, else? And my question to you before we go back to Marzipan and her friends is, looking back now, in your judgment, was better never to have been a treatise on pessimism or extinctionism or antinatalism or a combination thereof or something else altogether?
I think it's a treatise primarily on antinatalism, but I think that a pessimistic view about the quality of human life is a central part of the argument for that conclusion. And then extinctionism is an implication of the antinatalist conclusion.
All right. Thank you. So returning to Marzipan and her kind, she is a non-human created by humans and in human care. We have established here, I believe, that I'm morally permitted probably to kill her if by doing so I can prevent a particularly unpleasant future existence that makes it sort of similar to the infanticide and late abortion cases. Now, that, according to your definition, is probably not a paradigmatic case of antinatalism, but the fact that she shouldn't exist in the first place is, no question about it. If it's morally wrong to bring sentient beings into existence, it is morally wrong to create companion and production animals to fulfill human desires, which seems to make Better Never to Have been a strong declaration not only against human reproduction, but also against factory farming, animal husbandry, and the non-human pet market. Why am I seeing things in the wrong light here somehow? The question to you is Better Never to Have been an ode to vegan abolitionism?
Not explicitly, but I'm not denying that there are connections there. So I certainly do think that it is wrong to bring animals into being in order to kill them and eat them. But it's sort of overdetermined here because it would be wrong to create them in the first place on the ordinary anti-natalist grounds. And then when you couple that with the quality of life, the tremendously poor quality of life that they have, the harm just gets increased significantly. I think similarly about creating companion animals, but there's often a complexity in companion animals because at least some people are adopting companion animals that already exist. And when they do that, let's say from a pound in the case of dogs, an animal shelter, what they're actually doing is not creating a being, and they've had no part in creating the being, but they are playing a part in preventing the early death of that being. And because I take death to be bad for animals as well, I think they're actually doing something good for the animal. Now, I'm a little worried that your summary earlier suggests that I've already agreed that killing marzipan is okay, and I've not done that. I think if marzipan was suffering unspeakably now, then euthanizing her would be the right thing to do. But the fact that she's going to lead a normal life for a significant period and then succumb to suffering makes this harder, because the justification for euthanasia is not merely on the basis that at some point in the future somebody's going to suffer unbearably, because then we could just go around euthanizing piles of children now, because in 80 years' time they might suffer the horrors of cancer, let's say, and die. And I'm not committed to that. And in ordinary cases, we don't need to be committed to that, because you just put up with life for now until it gets to the point where it is no longer bearable. And in many cases, you will then be dealing with a competent being who's able to make that judgment for themselves. Even in the case of companion animals, though, you don't euthanize your puppy on the day you get your puppy. You try to give your puppy the best life possible. And then if you need to make the decision down the line to terminate the dog's life because that's in its overall interest, you do so. What's difficult about the Marzipan case is that you've got this one last window in which you can form the so-called euthanasia in order to prevent the suffering down the line. And that is a very difficult case. If you ask my intuitions on this, I'm likely to say that you wouldn't be justified in killing marzipan unless that suffering were fairly imminent.
And if the suffering were fairly imminent, then you would justify it.
I think you could make a case for it, yes. It's often difficult, even if you think about human cases, because what's happening now with the legalization of assisted dying for humans is there's some jurisdictions where people have not reached the point at which they would actually like to die, but they realize that if they continue much longer, they'll no longer be afforded the opportunity to gain assistance. So these are jurisdictions, for example, where if you have mental degeneration, but you pass the point where you're no longer competent to make decisions, then you can no longer get the assistance. And so what people are forced into is a choice whereby they seek to have their lives ended before they've reached the point that they would ideally like to die. Because if they don't make the decision now, they'll be deprived of that decision later. So that's the sort of closest analogy I would get in the human case. And those are real dilemmas. And I think they even present dilemmas for the doctors who are assisting in these cases, because they know that the person actually doesn't want to die now. And the only reason why they're authorizing it now is in order to prevent them having to linger on at a later point when they will no longer be afforded the opportunity.
Then fair enough. You would probably say that killing marzipan would be wrong, even for those merciful reasons. And yet you are saying that sometimes infanticide might be right, and I'm assuming that it doesn't have to be. I mean, the infant doesn't, or in your book, does the infant have to suffer now to justify the preemptive euthanasia, or is it sufficient that we know that the suffering will start in a week or two?
Well, I think if the suffering is now, it's not preemptive. It's that would be a standard case of euthanasia. I think the complexity in all of these cases is that there are gradations of considerations. So if you think about suffering doesn't come in one degree of intensity. There can be gradations. There can also be gradations in terms of how far in the future. Is it now? Is it in a minute's time, an hour's time, a day's time, a week's time, a year's time, 10 years' time? So there are gradations here. And I don't think it's possible to give a formula to say precisely when it's going to be justified and when it's not. So what I'm most comfortable doing is pointing out what I take the considerations to be. How we come down in a particular case depends on, as I've said, an array of things, including how bad do you take death to be for a being of a particular kind, and then how much suffering, and when will that suffering occur. Those are the kinds of considerations. And people can have different answers on those different points, and those are all going to impact, or could all impact, on the ultimate decision that you take. In the Marzipan case, what's particularly worrying for me is that this is, as you've described the case, so far in the future that she's going to suffer in this way, that I don't know what level of confidence you can have that this is in fact the likely outcome. And once your confidence levels get reduced, then I think you need to err on the side of not harming, even if you're going to be thereby possibly allowing harm.
I can see in operation the one point, one philosophical point on which we differ, and that is that death is a bad, and we don't have to go in there. I mean, if death is a bad for you and in your book, then it is. One other consideration that we could take into account, or should take into account here, when I'm permitting Marzipan's euthanasia, and you then probably aren't. Still, one consideration in the case of sentient humans and non-humans in our care, well, they are clear. I mean, it is clear to me that I should perhaps do that decision for Marzipan because she is in my care, and I should not breed guinea pigs or even let them breed, or any animals that are in our care. That's why I don't like factory farming or think that it's bad. And I think that even perhaps sterilization, chemical or surgical, might be an option for an anti-natalist activist now preventing the coming to existence of sentient lives. But, well, now this turns into two questions. And the first is, would you object strongly to sterilizing pet animals? And then there's the extinction. And the second question, what about sentient non-humans, Marzipan's cousins in the wild? They suffer too. And if a conscientious anti-natalist is comfortable with the idea of sterilizations, wouldn't they have to extend that to the wild too? Or more generally, how, if at all, should we as anti-natalists of your kind react to non-human reproduction and misery?
One answer to the question, I think, is clear for me, that we shouldn't be actively going out and breeding, whether it be companion animals or animals for human consumption. Now, if we're speaking about animals in the wild, or we're speaking about sterilizing animals, these raise other questions. And I'm going to, unfortunately, not satisfy you by just not answering that question now. I'm working on a new book at the moment, and I deal with these questions there. I'd like to work them out more fully in my mind and test them before I present them in a forum like this. So I would just like to delay answering that question if you like.
I'm sure we're all looking forward to seeing what your thoughts on this in your recent and forthcoming books will be. So good to know that things are brewing there. Coming back to Marzipan, some commentators have pointed out that her case doesn't fall under the notion of antinatalism as, and this is your definition, the view that it is morally wrong to bring sentient beings into existence. And this is of course correct. The case as such is something else. But it only needs a little tweak. Remember, applied philosopher, applied ethicist, always talking about something else. It only needs a little tweak to change the situation. Now consider this. In addition to all the other details, Marzipan is pregnant. Before her own demise, she would have the time to produce a litter. And this litter might or might not then go on to repopulate the earth with guinea pigs. Now, by killing Marzipan, I would not only spare her from her impending suffering, but also, knowingly or not, prevent many sentient beings from coming into existence, which is sort of good thing. So in our panel, and I think this can also be traced back to Better Never to Have Been, at least in spirit, one of your definitions was that antinatalist adjective is of or relating to a person, policy, practice, law, attitude, etc., that discourages or reduces, I'm emphasizing, reduces the reproduction of sentient beings. And now killing Marzipan, according to this, is plainly an antinatalist act, killing the pregnant Marzipan, because it reduces the reproduction of sentient beings. So if the question was, and mine was, does antinatalism as introduced in Better Never to Have Been ever involve killing, deliberately and intentionally taking lives? The answer seems to be yes, it does. So it seems to me. But you will have to be the judge of this. So the question, in your view, is this modest conclusion that antinatalism sometimes justifiably kills or justifies killing valid? Or have I somehow horribly misunderstood and misinterpreted your case?
Thanks. I think you have misrepresented me. I think the definition of antinatalism I'll stand by, but it doesn't follow, even as I say in Better Never to Have Been, that any means to an antinatalist end would be justified. That's going to depend in part on what other views you have. So if you think the ends always justify the means, then maybe you would think that going around killing pregnant women is justifiable because of the number of births you will prevent. But that's not a view I hold, because I take killing to be presumptively wrong, unless there's an excellent justification rooted in the interests of the being whose life you're taking. I wouldn't endorse that. That's why I don't endorse killing extinction. And so I don't think that if you're an antinatalist, you're committed to the view that all means for bringing about the prevention of birth are justifiable. That's going to require some additional views, which somebody may or may not have.
Yes, I understand. I understand. And you mentioned the killing of pregnant women. I was not suggesting that, because we have another stopper in there, and that's their autonomous choice. And you emphasized that on Better Never to Have Been all the time. So there's no question about that. I was talking about non-human, non-autonomous animals in our care.
Sorry, let me just clarify, if you don't mind. I agree those two cases are different. I was using it as an extreme case to illustrate how and somebody with an antinatalist end might not always accept antinatalist means. And one reason why they won't hear is because they think that respecting the autonomy of the person who you're considering killing is an important consideration. And so just as somebody might bring up that consideration, they might bring up some other kind of consideration with regard to Marzipan. It wouldn't be her autonomy, but it would be, in my view, the fact that she has an interest in continuing to live.
And have we now established that early abortion is an act of antinatalism or not?
Well, my view is it depends on what view you take about when somebody comes into existence in the morally relevant way. So I don't think that antinatalism per se tells you that early abortion is an antinatalist act. you've got to combine antinatalism with some other view about fetal moral status. And depending on which view you combine it with, you either reach the conclusion that you're preventing a life or ending a life.
And then I return to the point that then Better Never to Have Been is not just a book about antinatalism, it's a book about something else. Because let me quote you on this matter. It's about the early abortion. Thus, my conclusions should be viewed as recommendations about how a pregnant woman should make use of the freedom to choose whether or not to abort. I am recommending that she does abort and that she needs excellent reason not to. It should be clear that I don't think that there is any such reason. Now that's a pretty strong statement for early abortion being the killing of the fetus or the embryo. And so I don't know. Sorry, maybe I'm confusing things here.
No, I mean, I think that is my conclusion, but it's a conclusion that comes from two earlier conclusions. The one is antinatalism, and then there's the claim about fetuses not having moral standing prior to sentience. So once you put those together, then the conclusion that you've just read out follows. But it doesn't follow just from antinatalism alone.
Okay, so of these options, we have now concluded that Better Never to Have Been is a book about antinatalism and some other things.
I think it's fundamentally about antinatalism. It employs some pessimism in the argument, and then it has implications for extinctionism. But again, I don't think it has any implications for the Marzipan case. I think other views are relevant there.
Okay. Thank you very much. And thus spoke David Benatar, quite enlightening. I'm sure that our little chat has given our audience some food for thought. I'm thrilled that you could take the time to be here. So thank you very much, David.
And thank you for your interest in all of this. I really appreciate it. Very kind of you. Nice to have a discussion.
Thank you. And that concludes our proceedings here. To find out more, read David Benatar's books and stay tuned to this channel. Investigations continue.